Brother Murphy, if you would lead that prayer.
Father in heaven, in whom we live and move and have our being, Father, with humble and thankful hearts, we come together in this last period of this time. Thankful for the opportunity we have to study from the pages of your precious word. Pray that you bless our study together this morning, Father. Bless Stephen as he teaches us, bless us as participants. And as we look at this overview of Revelation, help us to come to a better understanding overall of John's message and the encouragement that it can give us as we face the difficulties that could hinder us from going to heaven. Help us to realize that we're going to heaven, that we're going to be victorious if we will just be faithful to you and faithful to your Son. Be with those who need our prayers, who may be sick or traveling. Forgive us of our sins, finally, and save us. We've been found faithful. We ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen.
A couple of years ago, well, probably more like 3 years ago, we had a study on Revelation that lasted quite a while. And I look back on that, and I think one of the reasons that it was so exhaustive is I was trying to teach two views at once. And I don't think I would go through the book again that way. So I appreciate y'all's patience in going through it. So this overview today is going to feel familiar for those who were here back then. I wanted to go ahead with it, though, because there are some that we have here that we didn't have then at that time. And maybe this overview can kind of whet the appetites of somebody who wants to dive deeper into it. And if that's you, then feel free to let me know, and we can arrange something, and we can go through it together. But it's a very worthy book. Revelation is a book that intimidated me for a long time. And I hope that you share that with me, that common intimidation, because you look at it and you're kind of like, well, I don't know about this, and I don't know about that, and it feels so odd and mysterious, and there's these monsters in this book. It's a book of monsters, basically, but also it's a book of hope, and it's a book of victory, and I think those are the things that we want to really focus on as we study together this morning. Somebody tell me what who wrote John?
I think you gave it away. Revelation.
Who wrote Revelation? John wrote Revelation, yes. So we're at the end of John's writings here. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago when we were going through 1 John that John actually may have written Revelation before the other letters. But it's still fitting that we put this at the end because this really ties together in that way. But what are some of the things that we want to remember and focus on? What are some things that we want to keep in mind in context of the early church when we read the book of Revelation? What are some things that we want to remember?
Well, they were having their troubles as churches do.
Okay.
Most of them had trouble.
Yeah.
I think two were not, they were, called out as good, but the other five had problems.
Right. Absolutely. When we look at chapters 2 and 3, that's exactly what we see. And one of the benefits of that is that we can identify with that, and we can recognize that. And it's kind of amazing how God basically provided us with a record to show us, okay, just about at its basis, just about any issue that you have could be boiled down to what these churches face in Revelation 2 and 3, which is so helpful for us. What else about the early church that we need to keep in mind? Think about the bigger context of Revelation as well.
They were going undergoing, let somebody else answer.
Okay.
If they will.
What was the early church undergoing? Persecution, yeah. And so that's a big theme of the book. And a lot of again, depending upon your view, I think this is true regardless. One of the stronger themes in the book is vengeance. Vengeance meted out by God toward the persecutors of his people, the persecutors of the saints. And so there's just a lot for us to deal with there and to consider that. But of course, the overall thing is that God wins, and we want to keep that in mind. We have the record of the 7 churches of Asia Minor, and of course you see Patmos on the lower left there. That's where John was exiled to. And we talked about various things a few years ago about, was this an exile in terms of punishment for his teaching the gospel? Was it just simply that he was there? Regardless, he was there, and it's very clear out of the first chapter. What's not clear, of course, is where he is in 1st through 3rd John. We talked about that, how that may have actually been after he was released from Patmos, and might have been in Ephesus around that time. But you can see what's fascinating is, if you look at this, the path of these churches, it goes from Ephesus to Smyrna to Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. It's even written in a route that would make sense. So it's really fascinating to consider that. There are 2 possibilities about when Revelation was written. And I boil it down to this, because what we understand, just like 1st through 3rd John, it is a 1st century work. There is no doubt about that. Especially when we, as we talked about with 1st through 3rd John, we have contemporary secular writers confirming John's time in writing the letters 1st through 3rd John. And then the fact that Revelation is outright saying, I, John, I wrote on Patmos, that helps us to understand that. But there is a distinction here, and I think these are the only 2 options that we have. Either it was written before 70 AD, during the reign of the Emperor Nero, or after 70 AD, near the close of the reign of Domitian, in about 81 to 96 AD. So really, there are tons of different views on Revelation, but I think these are the only 2 views that make sense. These are the only 2 views that are, I believe, to be scriptural views. And I'll say that as someone who leans toward the early date. I still believe that the late date is a scriptural understanding of the book. And I still believe that those who hold to that, I think that's a valid view of the book. I personally would disagree for various reasons, but the main point that we want to get to and understand is that God wins. And through that difficulty that we face, we can understand that even with what we face, God will win in our lives and ultimately. Here's a chart, and I don't know how well you can see this up here. I'll try to zoom in as I can. Let me see here. Yeah. So you can kind of see you've got the early date here, mentioned 54 to 68 AD in this chart, and the late date later on. This is from Art Ogden's material, and he lays up the emperors of Rome. And here's our 2 possibilities, written in the time of Nero, Caesar, or Domitian. And then he lists the Roman rulers in Judea at the time. And again, we don't have the time to go into the details of this, but one of the factors when you go into the late date is that aspect of the hostilities between the Jews and Rome ratcheting up in the time before 70 AD. So remember, Jesus had prophesied about that in Matthew 23 and in other 24, and a lot of people take that to mean, well, this is about the end of the world. Well, it was about the end of the Jewish world, even of course late daters will agree that that's what he prophesied. But what we see in Revelation is a great disaster of some kind. And so the fall of Jerusalem might be akin to the fall of Babylon in that sense. I think in that sense what we have here is that possibility in terms of the Jewish forces and the Roman forces becoming increasingly at odds with each other. Until, keep in mind, one of Jesus' apostles was Simon the Zealot. And who can tell me what the Zealots wanted in the first century?
They wanted to overthrow him.
Yeah, they were a group of Jews that were essentially militant, almost like we would say terrorist type Jews. And I believe that if Simon was faithfully following Jesus, I believe he abandoned that. But the whole point is to understand that those same people were younger in Jesus' time, but they grew up. And by the time about 30 or 40 years later, when all this was starting to come about, they ended up essentially in control of Judea. And so what did they do? Well, they rebelled against Rome. And they pushed against Rome. And there's various details that we've got. Josephus, in his works, he paints their rebellion in a very bad light. In fact, he talks about them as if they're very unscrupulous, immoral men that essentially would allow their own people to be killed in order to strike back at Rome. So all of that to say that if you're looking at early date, that's where we're looking at there in terms of the ratchets up in hostilities. I think the core of the book, one of the biggest things that we need to understand the book of Revelation, is what he says in the very first two verses. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ to all things that he saw. The revelation is this word apocalypsis, and we're going to have that in just a minute on our PowerPoint here so you can see that. But people talk about the apocalypse as if that's the end of the world. Well, really, apocalypse in the Greek sense, this just meant a revealing. This is the revealed message of Jesus Christ. God gave Jesus this message to show his servants the things which must take place when? Shortly. Not 2,000 years later.
No.
Not 100 years later. Shortly. That is the key to understanding this book, especially in light of how it is often misused today. Because here the Bible is saying the things that John was writing about will shortly take place. This tells us that the clear majority of this book took place either in John's lifetime or very soon after his death. I don't think you're looking beyond a realm of 10 years personally, because I'm thinking of this since this will shortly take place. The problem people get into is when they take it in this place where this is all in the future. The other part of this that also bolsters that, this was sent and he signified it, Jesus signified it by his angel to his servant John. What does it mean when something is signified?
Signs are used.
Signs are used, yeah. What else? If there was a message sent by a king in ancient times, what would they often do with the wax and everything? They would have a seal, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
And if you got that unbroken seal on that message, that would tell you, oh, that sign tells me that's from that king. And so the signs in Revelation point to the fact that Jesus is telling us something through his servant John. Now, primarily, John's audience was the first beneficiaries of this. And the first application must go toward them. It's wrong for us to take prophetic literature and take it away from its intended audience and to say, well, this applies to us. And so we look at things that happened yesterday, for example, and we try to look in Revelation, where is this point where was he hurt? Was the little horn, and it's like, no, I don't think that's what John is writing about. John is writing about things that would shortly take place. And the fact that it's signified tells us that these things that we see throughout the book, the throne room scene in chapters 4 and 5, the seals in chapter 6 all the way through 9, chapter 12, the dragon and the woman, chapter 13, the beast, and as all the things that we're going to try to go through this morning, all of that, none of that is literal. We're not talking about a literal beast coming out of the sea. We're talking about signs that point to something else. And so it's look, chapters 2 and 3, I mean, are all these churches just signified churches? They're not real? No, they're real churches. Not every point of this is going to be metaphorical, you might say. And just like in that same sense, we have to use our discernment to understand that not all of this shortly took place. I don't believe the judgment scene at the end of the book, where Satan is sent into the second death and so on and so forth, and all the enemies of God are defeated. I don't believe that's happened yet. Now, there are some who do believe that. And what the term that I've heard for that is hyper-preterist. Preterist just simply means that you believe this was written before 70 AD. You believe the early date. So technically I'm a preterist. But hyper-preterist would say this has all been already fulfilled. And the destruction of Jerusalem was just the end of all God's dealings with man. And now, and of course, we know and understand that creates a ton of problematic questions that we frankly can't answer without going outside of the Word of God. And so I don't bring that up for us to think about that, but rather to say that it says it's signified, but let's keep in mind we're still using our discernment. Even in the prophets of the Old Testament, they would mention things that were literal people and literal things, even in the midst of using this figurative prophetic imagery. And that is a huge key as well, to note that the signs and the symbols we find in Revelation, they correspond pretty much exactly to the words of Daniel, the words of Ezekiel, the words of Isaiah, all helping us understand something. What John seems to be doing is he's using this Old Testament imagery to communicate something to the brethren of the first century. So again, we do the book a great disservice when we look through it and we read through it trying to figure out, looking at world events today and trying to line it all up. No, that's not how we use this. We listen to God. We sit at His feet. We let Him tell us what the truth is. We don't try to assign it to it's kind of like we're trying to take the square block and put it into the triangle opening, right? It doesn't fit. It's not going to work. We need to let God tell us what the truth is here. And so John, who bore witness to the Word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ of all things that he saw, what a gift that is. A brief outline of the book, chapters 1 through 3, Christ in the church. Christ being all together in the church. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. 4 through 11, the apocalypse from heaven. 12 through 20, the apocalypse from earth. And 21 and 22, the New Jerusalem. What I mean by the apocalypse from heaven, the story of Revelation is actually told 2 times. The first half of the book details this aspect, that here's God's people, here's His rule, and here are His saints who are suffering. And they're suffering under intense persecution. But God is not going to let this situation stand. He's not going to let this go on forever. And so He will, at some point, He will allow the persecutors to be severely punished. And He will bring justice to His people. And He will bring them to victory if they overcome with Him. And so that constant aspect as well in the book of God is winning. Are you on His side? God is overcoming. Are you allied with Him? Are you part of the people that's standing with the Lamb? Or are you allied with the dragon? That's the question that the book asks us. And it behooves us to answer that and to consider that ourselves. So the story at first is told from the vantage point of heaven. What I mean by that, we have in chapters 4 and 5 a scene from heaven, the throne scene, this amazing throne scene. And that continues on. Primarily, we're looking at in terms of the spiritual aspect of things. But then in 12 through 20, we're kind of looking more at events on earth. It's still from a spiritual perspective, but there's more of a quality where we're more looking at the things that are happening essentially on the ground. It's kind of like when a general or a war leader is in his war room and he's planning out his campaign. He's got the map before him. That seems to be the first half of the book to me, where he's from on high. He is essentially stating this is how this is all going to be. All the seals opening and all the things that happen from that. Whereas the last half of the book seems to be what's actually happening on the battlefield, what's going on the ground. And then the last 2 chapters are about the New Jerusalem, about the new situation that comes out of this scenario. So it's just fascinating when you look at it that way. Again, if you're looking at the early date, this is a story about how God's people were saved from the intense, wrathful persecution of the Jews through God allowing the Romans to go and destroy Jerusalem, level it, and therefore Jewish intense persecution was no longer a thing. Now, of course, even with early date, you still admit and you see the Roman persecution that followed later on. Some of the early date authors will kind of go, I don't know about too far, but Art Ogden in his book, he makes a case in one of his appendixes that there's no evidence at all that Domitian ever had a widespread persecution of Christians. That he basically says there are no ancient sources for this, but I don't really take a hard stance on that point, except just to say that there are some textual things that make more sense to me for the early date. If you are a late date person, if you're looking at this through that lens, this becomes a story of the Roman persecution of the saints, the state being used in that way, which again, same thing either way, in my opinion, with the Jews or the Romans, the state being used as a method of persecution. And we'll deal more with that in a minute. But that tells us that this is a point where God freed his people from persecution. At that point, actually, the resolution of it stretches farther out than the destruction of Jerusalem. That's kind of one of my difficulties with the late date view. When exactly did Rome fall? Historians are actually in difference about that. But the whole point is God wins. And that's really the goal that we want to keep in mind here. Again, things that must shortly take place. And John is on Patmos. He writes to the 7 churches. And I think the 7 there signifies completeness. This is comprehensive. What we have to understand from chapters 2 and 3 is that God is writing to all churches everywhere. And even today, now, I don't know if you remember the study that we had on Revelation. I titled that lesson, To Show His Servants, because we're supposed to be shown this too. And if we're too intimidated by the book of Revelation to really try to understand it, how can he show it to us? We can't really see if we're not willing to see. Just a brief note on that too. I really would encourage you to spend the time, even if not with me, but to spend the time to get to know this book. Especially if you've been a Christian for a long time, you've never really looked at it in detail. Figure out where you are on it. Understand it for what it is. Because I'll tell you this, I believe the book of Genesis is more mysterious than the book of Revelation. Some of you who have looked at Genesis with me know I've mentioned that, because there's so much in Genesis that we just kind of look at and we have to kind of throw our hands up and say, I don't know what's happening here. I don't know where this person came from. I literally don't know where Cain got his wife. I know she probably came from Eve because Eve is the mother of all living, but that's all I got to go on. Whereas with Revelation, there's so much that we can actually put our hands on. There's some things that I don't really know. Some of the bowls of wrath, I'm not really sure what exactly on the earth that might have been pointing to or focusing on. But don't let your intimidation of this book keep you from looking at it, because as you do, it will strengthen your faith. It will help you in your confidence. It'll help you understand and see, well, if God can take care of them, He can take care of me. If God can give them safety, He can give me safety and peace. If I trust in Him, if I overcome with Him. And so that is the point. It's written in a time of great persecution. And John's message is, hold on. God always wins. Overcome with Him. The first chapter does focus on Jesus' great power and omnipresence. This description of Jesus is just amazing to me. In verse 12 of chapter 1, look there with me. Verse 12. Then I turned to see the voice that spoke with me. And having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. In the midst of the 7 lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the feet and girded about the chest with a golden band. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes like a flame of fire. His feet were like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. He had in his right hand 7 stars. Out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was like the sun shining in its strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying to me, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am he who lives and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. Amen. And I have the keys of Hades and of death. Write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after this. The mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands which you saw are the 7 churches. That is, I hope you're with me in that if I saw what John saw, I'd probably do about what he did. That's an intimidating vision. But that is the vision of our victorious King. As I've mentioned before, we don't need to just think about Jesus as hanging, beaten, suffering on a cross. We need to see him as the victorious, conquering King that he is. And we need to be willing to ride alongside him in battle, to fight with him, to follow him wherever he goes. That's really what we start with in this book. And I've got a handout here, and let me go ahead. Let's see. Jeremy, would you be willing to pass that out? Some of you may already have this handout, but this is actually something arranged by Doyle Moyer. It's just really, as you might say, a handy-dandy chart concerning the 7 churches. And as we look through it, we remember Jesus has control over the churches. That's what we see in chapters 2 and 3. He is king or head of the church, right? And so since he is the head of the church, he has power over the church. He knows when a church is faithful or unfaithful. And he has the power to remove the lampstand of a church, meaning he has given that church up, basically. Now, we don't know when this happens, but we know that it can happen. And you think about scenarios, as I recently understood a lot of the problems happening within the Methodist Church right now. You've got Methodist churches that want to leave the United Methodist Church for the very fact that they're being dominated by woke insanity. But those churches can't leave legally. They can't just use their buildings in the way they want to, because they've entered into this sort of agreement where the whole church has control over all of this, and so, but we see, it's so clear when you look at this, that's getting in the way of Jesus, who is the head of the church. That's a different scenario. That's not a faithful church. That's not. So he has the power to remove the lampstand of a church. And as we look through and we see the issues with Ephesus, the church who lost their first love, a faithful church, a good church. We see Smyrna, a good, faithful church that was warned of persecution. As I mentioned with Ephesus, though, they've got one issue, right? They've left their first love. I don't know what that means, but they're in danger unless they repent. With Smyrna, one of the faithful churches, they were warned of persecution. Pergamos is a church who had compromised with certain teachings and certain doctrines. Thyatira was a corrupted church, which had apparently a Jezebel or someone like that teaching things that were wrong and leading the saints to do things that were wrong. Sardis was a church who was dead. They had a name that they were alive, but they were dead. And then Philadelphia, the church who had an open door of opportunity with the Lord, a door that no one can close. Of course, the question is, with all churches, when we have an open door, will we take that? Will we go with that? Or will we just let that sit there? And then finally, Laodicea, which is arguably in the worst situation of these churches. Laodicea revolts God. They think they're wealthy. They think they've got everything. But really, they're poor. They're blind. They're miserable. They're naked. And so God, Jesus tells them to buy from him what they need to be faithful. So this is how we start this book. Any comments or any questions? I haven't really opened it up to that very much, but anybody have any thoughts up to this point, and especially about the churches? Anything I may have missed?
You were talking about the Thyatira being compromised. Was it Thyatira? Whichever one it was.
Yeah, I was talking about Pergamos being compromised.
Yeah, well, that's very symbolic of what has happened in the world, as far as churches are concerned. All kinds of stuff.
Well, the difference I would make there is that I don't believe the churches of the world I don't think they have lampstands, right?
No. That's
But,
what I mean. I'm trying to say that's what's happened to God's Word in the churches, man-made churches.
Sure.
It's been compromised. I just say
Yeah.
it's sort of symbolic of that.
Yeah, and that's the thing is all of these churches at this point, as we read the letter, they're still in fellowship with God. But Jesus is telling them, hey, here's something you need to fix, or I can't have fellowship with you anymore. And the thing we need to remember about chapters 2 and 3 is none of these churches still exist. They're all gone. And so we need to learn the lesson that congregations are not forever, and that the work of the kingdom is the only thing that matters. That's the only thing that matters. Anything else? So following along from that, in chapters 4 and 5, we get this amazing throne scene where he says in chapter 4, verse 1, I looked and behold a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, come up here, and I will show you things which must take place after this. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he mentions the description of the one of the throne being of a jasper and sardius stone. He talks about a rainbow around the throne like an emerald. He talks about 24 thrones set up there and 24 elders seated on them. And I think there are some possibilities here. Again, I'm not going to get into the details with all this. We just don't have time. But if you ever want to have a more detailed study, just let me know. And be glad to deal with that individually. You have the sea of glass before them. You have the four living creatures praising God. And their praise is holy, holy, holy. They do not rest day or night, saying in verse 8, holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. When we read that when we sing that song, we can remember this throne scene in chapter 4. And so it describes this throne scene. And then in chapter 5, we have a scroll that shows up sealed with 7 seals. It's in the right hand of the one who sat on the throne. And it's a scroll written inside and on the back. And the angel asks, who is worthy to open the scroll and loose its seals? And no one is able to do this. But there is one that was worthy. They say, do not weep, verse 5, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has prevailed to open the scroll and to loose its 7 seals. And then he says, I looked, and behold, in the midst of the throne of the 4 living creatures, in the midst of the elders, stood a giant lion that, looked very strong and mighty and a lamb, as though it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes. So the Lion of Judah, the root of David, he prevails. Even though he, from certain aspects, he looks like nothing. He looks like an injured lamb. Well, what's this great, worthy warrior, fighter, conqueror? Well, he's not what you expect. But he is who he is. You need to accept him as he is. And so after the scroll is, when he had taken the scroll, verse 8, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. And they sing a new song, singing about the worthiness of him to take the scroll. Isaiah 42 is a mirror of this song. He says, you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation, have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth. Reigning with Jesus is another theme that you find coming through the book, and I don't fully understand what that basically means, except to say I believe there is an aspect that we reign with Jesus when we fight with the weaponry that we're given. And not in a sense of proving how smart we are or what we figured out, but it's just simply hiding ourselves behind the Word of God and allowing God to fight our battles, to say, well, this is what God says. This is the truth. So the new song that they sing here, worthy is the Lamb who was slain, verse 12, to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing. And then, verse 13, blessing and honor and glory and power be to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb forever and ever. I believe the one on the throne would be the Father and the Lamb would be Jesus. Well, starting in chapter 6 to verse 7, we have the start of these 6 seals and then an interlude. The first seal he has is a white horse. The second seal, a fiery red horse. The third seal, a black horse. And the fourth, a pale horse. And these signify different things. I think that the whole idea that we have here is God is allowing a force of some kind to strike in certain ways. And we're talking about basically the suffering that would come out of various aspects of the trouble that was happening that caused the persecution. And so, again, there are more details to go into, but we just simply don't have the time. But the sense here is that God is allowing certain forces to take on these things. Now, again, some people will look at the first seal, the white horse, as being the same thing as Jesus later on in the book. That may be a possibility as well. Regardless, this is God giving power to various forces to be able to accomplish certain things by his authority. Then we get to the point in chapter 6 where we hear the fifth seal, the cry of the martyrs, souls slain for the word of God. And there's an Old Testament comparison here. He talks about, and really the core cry they're saying in verse 10 of chapter 6, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And then a white robe was given to each of them. And it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who should be killed as they were was completed. So there's an aspect of restraint and waiting here. Leviticus 4 and verse 7 talks about how the priest will put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense before the Lord that is in the tent of meeting, and all the rest of the blood of the bull he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering that is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So even in the Old Testament, the Jews didn't have a reason for why God wanted them to do that, to pour the blood out at the base of the altar. But what John is telling us is that there's a parallel here. That even back then was symbolic of those who would die for the sake of the gospel in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because when we look at that and we understand what the gospel is, it stretches in both ways. So, for example, someone who is put to death in the Old Testament, I'm thinking about, not necessarily put to death, but Micaiah tells the truth to Ahab and Jehoshaphat. But then afterwards, he's held in prison for the rest of his life and fed with the bread of affliction. And so you have those saints that have served in the past for telling the truth. And that's the core relation here, is that you have those who are suffering and they're calling for justice. And only God can deliver that justice. Jesus tells the apostles in Matthew 24 that when then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake, and then many will be offended, will betray one another. He mentions false prophets. But he says, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. Similar statements in Mark 13, where he's telling his apostles, they're going to imprison you. They're going to hurt you. They're going to go after you for what you say. But you keep saying it. You keep going. You endure until the end. And so that's a big theme of the book there. And then really, as we see the rest of chapter 6 and into this interlude in chapter 7, you have these, what I would say, cosmic disturbances, these issues where you have, not cosmic, but not literally, but big things happening, big earth-shaking, world-shaking events. Whenever you have the stars falling from the sky in prophetic literature, for example, it talks about powerful leaders falling from their places of positions of power. And you have that aspect going through. So again, we're looking at the signification aspect here. None of this literally happened. The great earthquake, sun became black as sackcloth, the moon became as blood. But what we find is that it's pointing to big earth-changing events, world-changing events. And those things can be scary. People are intimidated by change. We don't like change. We want things to stay the same. But here we have this point made. Wes Brown mentioned in his notes, it may not be the end of the world, but it is the end of someone's world. It's a huge change here. And Jesus warned about this in Luke 23. He said the time would come in which they will say, blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. Well, that's exactly what's happening here. And it is thought that this could be, and this is why I bring up Hebrews 12, it could be that this is part of the shakeup of things. After, again, if you're early date, after the destruction of Jerusalem, that Jewish persecution is no more. But in the meantime, the church is going to get wrapped up in the Roman takedown of Judea and the hostility of the Romans against Jews, because why are they going to care to distinguish between the Jews and what they believe is just a sect of the Jews? So there's a lot of danger for the church in that time. But just great changes. You have also in chapter 7 the slain faithful sealed. It mentions 144,000 sealed of all the tribes of Israel. People make a big deal about this and say, well, who's the 144,000? Who's that going to be? And they think it's a certain amount of people, or it's the Jews, or so on and so forth. But I really think this is talking about a set number of faithful Christians or slain faithful Jews that were faithful under the old law. All of that's a possibility there. But the whole main point is the concept of sealing speaks of being made secure in this way, that they are safe. And then you find, beyond the 144,000, a numberless multitude wearing white robes and holding palm branches. And they're crying out, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne, to the Lamb." I think that's all of the kingdom of Christ. I think that's the church. That's those who have died with Christ. And so God's truth prevails. In chapter 7, you find 2 witnesses killed and resurrected. I think this is focusing on the law and the prophets. And then you have the 7th trumpet, which is praise for God's judgments. Well, just to briefly go through, you have the trumpets kind of take over this point, where the seals are done, and then you have silence, and then you have 4 trumpets. Chapter 9, 2 more trumpets. Chapter 10, the little book. And then finally, chapter 11, the witnesses in the 7th trumpet. Again, I just don't have the time to go through these without... if I started to go through them, we would get too much into details. But basically, this tells the story of God's judgments being carried out and all the effects of those judgments. And the fact that those judgments are being witnessed by His Word. And the way things are working out is exactly how He said it would be. Again, I think this really strengthens the notion of the early date, because Jesus prophesied 40 years prior, this is what was going to happen to Jerusalem. But after Jesus had ascended into heaven, there was still cause for the Jewish rulers to say, well, that hasn't happened. What Jesus said, the temple hasn't been destroyed, it hasn't been laid waste like He said. He said not one rock would be on another. Well, that hasn't happened. The temple stands to this day. Well, that certainly didn't last forever. And so I think the point made here is that God's Word is witness to His judgments. And that's the key in understanding this. Well, chapter 12, we get into this story of the woman and the dragon. Just very briefly, I believe the woman is faithful Israel. I don't think she is representative of just Mary, or anything like that. Israel itself birthed Jesus. I know Mary did specifically. But Jesus was the culmination and the ultimate product of what God had done with His people over thousands of years. All the way back to the promises to Abraham. And so, and even beyond that, in terms of the promise of the Messiah. And so we have this scenario where, in this story, where this woman appears. And she's signified, there's various aspects of her, but she's about to give birth. And another sign, verse 3, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and His throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Again, don't get tied up in the numerology here, except to say we've got these specific numbers. And I think the specific numbers in this book tell us something about there's going to come an end to this. Especially in terms of 1,260 days, it tells us there's only so much time that the church is going to be under this persecution and needing to avoid that, which I think is part of what he's pointing to there. But then you look that war broke out in heaven, verse 7. This war between Michael and his angels, they fought with the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail. Nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. My personal thought is this occurred with the crucifixion of Jesus. That once Jesus died for the sins of the world, that was it. You know, you have that evidence in the book of Job where Satan is able to kind of go between heaven and earth almost at will, right? Well, at this point, it seems, after Jesus died on the cross, it doesn't seem like that's the case anymore. I'm very briefly going through this. I hope you understand. There's a lot of things to consider. But verse 10, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Verse 11 is a sermon, isn't it? You've got everything you need right there to tell us about what the church is and who we ought to be and so on and so forth. But the blood of the Lamb, that was shed at the cross. And then you have that continuing on persecution. The dragon had been cast to the earth, verse 13, and he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, where she is nourished for time and times and half a time, again, only a certain amount of time, from the presence of the serpent. So there is a sense here where the dragon is constantly trying to frustrate and stop the forces of God. And when he can't win the war in heaven, he's flown to the earth, he keeps waging this war here on the earth. And I think we see the results of that everywhere around us. I think we see how that comes about. And it should be pretty clear the dragon is Satan. That's literally said, right? In verse 9, the serpent of old, called the devil and Satan. I love how he's called the serpent of old. And whereas God is portrayed in Revelation and Jesus is portrayed in a new light. This is the new way. This is the right way versus this old, decrepit, ancient way that Satan tries to push. What's interesting here, too, as you consider the support of these things and the encouragement of these things, those who are working with Satan, the Jewish rulers did say in John 19:15, we have no king but Caesar, which to me greatly bolsters what we see in chapter 13. In chapter 13, we have a beast rising up from the sea. The thought is that this beast is being put forward. And again, this starts our final section of the book here as far as the second telling of the story. Satan brings about this beast from the sea. The thought is that the dragon has been defeated, and so he's now sending his servant. And what I was going to mention earlier as well, when I was studying through Daniel for the first time, and was really looking at, what's this little horn in chapter 7? He's pompous, he speaks great words and things like that. And a brother really helped me out by saying, well, maybe it's not a specific person. Maybe it's a general idea. What happens when the state is used to persecute Christians? Well, then at that point it becomes a beast. It becomes something that is beyond our control. It's kind of like when a government project is set up to do something. You got to be careful with it, because it's like it may rise up and do things that you're not expecting. And sometimes when we have bureaucracy that's trying to even help certain situations in society, sometimes they make them worse. But the whole point that we need to understand is that when man takes it upon himself to organizationally, by the hands of government, persecute the saints, government becomes beastly. It becomes animalistic. It's unable to be controlled. It's unable to be reasoned with. And the best you can do is to avoid it. The best you can do is to simply keep doing what God tells you to do, even in spite of that. And this is just, the pictures I'm putting up here, of course, are artist renditions. I don't really think any of them that I've found are 100% accurate to the text. But this beast is given power and authority to persecute the saints. And he was going to continue, verse 5, for 42 months. There's another number, but let's keep in mind, it's a finite number. That's it. The whole point that we're getting across here is that he wasn't continued, and it's not going to be able to continue forever. And then he talks about authority given over him over every tribe and tongue and nation, verse 7. All who dwell on the earth will worship him. And but he says in verse 10, he who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. I think the goal there, I think the point there is this beast has an end. And I believe this verse in verse 10 is telling us, I believe the beast is Rome. I believe God is saying, even from an early date perspective, that this beast is going to have an end. That he's going to stop. And that's exactly what happened. Rome did end. So, again, I think that's the best way for us to look at it personally. And then he sees in the latter part of the chapter another beast coming out of the earth. And he had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in presence, causes the earth, those who dwell in it, to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast. The image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of the one. Then he mentions the number of the beast being 666, which Art Ogden is very specific with. That if you look at Jewish numerology, the values there exactly match up to the Roman name Nero Caesar. I don't know how far to take that, but it could be that in the time he's pointing to that as like, this is what you see going on. But the mark of the beast, we talk about that. People are concerned. What's the mark of the beast? And as I understand, back in the 70s, people were concerned about the mark of the beast being the barcodes on items that you buy, right? And then about 20 years later, people were concerned about credit cards or debit cards being the mark of the beast. I think we need to be more general. Every time you look at prophetic literature, the more general you're able to be, the better your conclusion is likely to become. So what if the mark is just simply you belonging to Satan? You know, and you giving yourself over to that mindset. What if the mark of the beast is just anything but God? You know, if you're married to your job, well, that marks you. If you're steeped in enthusiasm about something that is not the Lord, well, that's a place to be really careful. Otherwise, that will mark you. People will see what you're passionate about versus what maybe you go along with, but maybe not as passionate about. And so that's Satan's goal. Satan's goal is not to just make us full disciples, but he does make those idols speak. In the ancient world, as I understand, sometimes they would have people behind these statues. And they would have these, when you're at a playground and you get the one place where it's like a little horn going into the ground, you can talk into it and you can hear, they can hear you in the other one. As I understand, that's what they used to do in a lot of these idol worship, these temples, is they would have someone speaking into a receiver like that or some kind of pipe that would go out to where the idol would talk in certain scenarios. So I think that's the parallel here, where this beast from the earth is giving voice to the image of the beast and promoting that religion. And that's just so important for us to remember, that there is a religion in this world that opposes God. And it's not just one religion. It's not just Islam. It's not just Judaism. It's not just this or that. It's the whole thing. Because Satan doesn't care. Satan doesn't care if you're worshiping him literally or if you're worshiping some other thing. Anything but God. That's Satan's idea. And so the mark identifies those with the support of the beast. And I think really what we're talking about is Rome in the immediate context. So then in chapter 14, we have a following picture here where you have a lamb standing on Mount Zion with 144,000 there. And if we're talking about the same 144,000, then we're talking about those who were sealed in this. But then you have also the sense of those who are redeemed with him, not defiled with women, verse 4. The ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. So ultimately you have those who are faithful to God. And then you have the angels proclaiming the fall of Babylon in this chapter. And there is the sense here where when you think about what's being said and the conflicts to come, there's a lot to consider there. Again, we just do not have the time to get into all this. One thing I do want to mention as you read through this in chapters 14, 15, 16, you have the rejoicing in God's judgment. And then in chapter 16, the bowls of wrath mentioned. People talk about Armageddon, the Battle of Armageddon. What's going to happen at the Battle of Armageddon? Where the forces of darkness are going to battle against the forces of God and so on and so forth. I would again suggest that this war that broke out in heaven in chapter 12, that's the same battle that we're talking about there. And I believe that battle was won by Jesus on the cross. And so that battle's already done. It's not a battle that we look forward to and we kind of wonder who's going to win. No, God has already won. And there are some prophetic things to be said there. There, north of Galilee, there was the mountain of Megiddo. And the meaning and the term mentioned in this text coincides or correlates with that as well. So it could be that John is paralleling or mentioning some battle that was taking place there. Megiddo was one of the first places that some battles did take place when Rome invaded Israel and Judah, so Judea. So that may be a possibility there. But chapter 17, we go back more with the beast, and we find there's a woman actually riding on the beast. And her name is Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abomination of the earth. She is drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. I personally believe this to be Israel riding upon the beast. Israel in the first century, if you understand how the Sanhedrin worked, they had power over all the Jews everywhere, not just in Israel. But if you were a Jew in some other country across the Mediterranean, you still had to answer to the Sanhedrin. Otherwise, you would be forbidden from the synagogue. We know from the Gospels they had the power to remove people from the synagogues. And what that would mean is you'd be socially ostracized. You basically would be cast off. And in some scenarios, you might even be stoned to death. And so Jerusalem had a lot of control and influence and power over the Jews of the ancient world. And one of the ways that Israel was able to exercise that power was the deal they had with Rome. Rome allowed Israel to continue their religion undaunted and unhindered. The story goes that when Rome originally came to Jerusalem, and we're talking with the leaders and the rulers of Judea at that time, this is, I think if I remember, about 200, 300 BC. The story is that they were saying, well, we're going to need to build statues of our gods in these streets. This is what Rome did. They would come in and they would want syncretism, a blending of religions. You keep your religion, but you've got to incorporate our stuff too. And so they were trying to tell the rulers of this, and they said, well, we're going to have to do this. And the rulers said, no, you're not going to do that. And the story goes that, well, we can kill you and bring someone else and put someone else in your place from your own people. And at that point, the story goes that the rulers then just expose their necks to these Romans, as if to say, go ahead. This was a post-exile population that had learned that idol worship was wrong, and they weren't going to have it. And Rome actually backed off at that point. Rome didn't force them to do that, which is just completely unique. So I don't want to go too far into that, but just to say that it makes sense to me that the woman riding the beast here, if the beast is Rome, then Israel would still be guilty of the blood of the saints in the first century. Think about the people that Paul had a hand in leading to their death, causing them to blaspheme, and various things like that. And that's, Paul is just one aspect. Think about 40 years of that, with various multiple Jews from the Sanhedrin leading a charge of persecution toward the Christians. The other thing, if you're looking at a late date, this is going to be basically the city of Rome seated upon the empire of Rome, which causes some problems for me, but it may not for others. But that's basically what the thought is. But the meaning of the beast, and then go through that toward the rest of chapter 17. But in chapter 18, you have the fall of Babylon and the end of that. All the benefits that the world had from this system and from the economic benefits they had and the social benefits they had, all that's just destroyed completely. And what you have from that too in 1920, the exaltation over Babylon and the victory of Babylon. The one challenging thing about Revelation that we need to keep incorporate is when God proclaims a judgment and metes out punishment from that judgment, the saints praise him for his judgments. The saints do not have sympathy and sadness over, I wish things were like they were when Babylon was still around, No, that's not what the saints do. The saints proclaim victory. They share in this overcoming. And that's what we need to do as well. It's sad when we have a spiritual failure happen in front of us. But sometimes Babylon has to fall. Sometimes those who are not right with God, sometimes they have to hit rock bottom in order to understand that they can come back. I know it's not exactly the same thing, but I think another thing we think of, we think about how things are now and how concerned we might be that things might not be this good in America in the future. Let's never let nostalgia for what was keep us from doing what's right now. And so I think we need to share in that exaltation over the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, riding victorious over the forces of darkness. And then we have Satan bound for 1,000 years. Before that, at the end of chapter 19, you have the beast and his armies defeated. The beast cast in the lake of fire and brimstone. Again, regardless of what you think of late date, early date, I believe this has already happened. That Rome did indeed fall, and ultimately everyone that was able to persecute the saints in that fashion, in that way of empire, that's no longer. But then you have this sense where, with the binding of Satan in chapter 20, notice in verse 3, cast in the bottomless pit, shut him up, set a seal on him, so he should not deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things, he must be released for a little while. That little part, I don't have a handle on 100%. And there is some speculation there. I don't know if Satan's already been released or not. My personal take on this is, how was Satan deceiving the nations? Through the use of the Roman Empire. And how might he do that again? Through the use of empire. And who has the biggest empire in the world? America. That's some sobering things. It's a little spooky. to think about it that way. I'm not trying to scare anybody. But there is a point to be made here that, like, we're going to give this up to God. Let God, we're going to be faithful no matter what. That's our goal. We don't have to understand all of this. What we have to do is to be faithful. So the saints reign with Christ for 1,000 years. That 1,000 years, people talk about premillennialism and postmillennialism. Amillennialism would be a different view on its own. The thought with premillennialism is that this 1,000 years is where Jesus sets up his earthly kingdom before the millennium starts. And there's conversation there. Is it post-tribulation, rapture, that sort of thing? All of that is just, I'm just going to say it's nonsense. There's nothing in the Bible to suggest that. That is a complete misusing of the scriptures. Post-millennial will say that Jesus sets up his earthly kingdom after millennium starts. Problem is, he's not going to have an earthly kingdom. The kingdom is in you. The kingdom is spiritual. The kingdom is such that no one can ever invade it. No one can ever conquer it. And so I think if we're looking at our position, it's going to be closer to what we think of as amillennial. This is not a literal millennium. Rather, it's right now where Christ reigns in earth and on heaven. He reigns on earth through his saints, and he reigns in heaven as the Son of God. Well, just to finally look at this too, the last two chapters, we have the new situation. All things are new. The bride, the tabernacle are mentioned in chapter 21. And the whole point that we have to understand with all this is that God is there. And that's where we want to be. I've made the case that 21 and 22, there are aspects of this that could be even right now. I know that we don't have heaven in that sense, but we have the kingdom. And we're told to have eternal life now in the New Testament. We need to think of our time now, after we died with Christ. That was the start of our eternal life. We're not just waiting someday for eternal life to be granted to us. We must be living as if we're eternal right now, because we want to listen to God. And when you think about the New Jerusalem, the city of New Jerusalem, it's a big help. I mean, to me, it's a big help to think about this as a current thing. My life is, I am in New Jerusalem, and I'm walking down that street of gold, and I'm getting closer and closer to God's throne every day. And the closer I get means that I've purified myself more and more. And I may stumble here and there, but my brethren are there to help me get up and to keep walking toward that throne. But the worst thing I could possibly do is say, this is too hard. The gates are all open. I'm leaving. And that is the warning, right? In verse 8, the cowardly, I'm looking in chapter 21, the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So it's New Jerusalem or the second death. That's what the book leads you to in this conclusion. And these words are faithful and true. You can trust them. That's what chapter 22 says. So again, there's so much that we just did not have time to get into. I appreciate your focus on this. If you would like to study through this book, I would love to do that. If individually you want us to get a group together and we'll go through it. Those of you who weren't here when we went through it in detail a few years ago, be happy to do that. Anything else before we finish up today? Murphy and then Jordan.
There's a book by Farrell Jenkins, I think, that was still in print. And I have a copy of it somewhere in my library. It's titled The Old Testament. It's a little soft, but it's called the title The Old Testament Book of Revelation. I would encourage those who don't have it to get that book. It will really help.
It's very helpful. And Farrell Jenkins was a late date guy, but he was good friends with Art Ogden, who was early date. So again, we need to keep in mind, regardless of the view of the book, we can still, go along together and study of it and benefit from it in that way. So, yes, sir.
I was just going to say, you're talking about the kingdom and how life is now, like becoming a Christian and living is the beginning of eternal life. Jesus said, I come to bring life, more that you might have life more abundantly. I kind
Yeah.
of see a parallel there.
Absolutely. Anything else? Thank you for your time.